Hello and welcome to the video presentation for module number 11. This module is more about chord structures in posttonal music and harmony in posttonal music. We're just going to be talking about two concepts in this video that are commonly happen in posttonal music. One is called parallelism and the other is called pandiatonicism. So some mouthfuls there, but we'll dive into them here. So let's first talk about something called non-functional harmony, which the book kind of brings up, and it is worth discussing a little bit. So the term non-functional is applied to any harmonies or chord progressions or just chords that do not conform to what we call traditional concepts of chord progressions or chord construction, and particularly the chord progression part. So we think of functional harmony as being the underlying fabric of a chord progression where things center around a tonic and move to a subdominant chord maybe, eventually leading us to a dominant, which pushes us back to a tonic chord. So each chord in the scale has a function, a role to play. And the most important one is the tonic, because everything leads back to that chord. In non-functional harmony, that doesn't really exist. And there's various variations and ways that can be implemented, but essentially it just means that there may or may not be a tonic, or there may or may not be a clear dominant chord. There's some kind of non-traditional, non-functional relationship the chords have that is not bound to the rules of function that we are used to. And these kinds of chords are heard in posttonal music because they can be used to obscure a tonal center, right? If there's no tonic or dominant relationship or subdominance, there's no structure, right? There's no hierarchy of chords. So that means that the tonal center might not be clear. But they're often used with chords that have thirds in them or chords that are from a diatonic scale. So there's some degree of familiarity because they are tied to a diatonic scale or they're chords made out of thirds. Right? So it's a way of kind of having the best of both worlds. You have some ambiguity with your tonal center and tonal function, but you still have the familiarity and the nice sounds that come with the diatonic scale and chords made out of thirds. Okay, so let's talk about the first concept, which is called planing or parallelism. They're kind of synonymous terms. And planing is the technique of moving a chord structure up or down, and there is little or no connection to a harmonic function. So here's a tiny example of what planing looks like. And I'll play this for you, and you can kind of hear the chords. There are different chords in this, but they don't really sound like they have any function. They just sound like they're moving up and down. So it kind of makes the tonic a little bit unclear. I mean, you have that pedal E, right? So maybe E minor is the key, but it starts and ends on an A minor 7 chord. There's not really any, B7 that leads us back to E, right? It could be G, but I don't see any G chords in here. So there's that ambiguity. And this extreme use of parallel motion, right? So every chord has a fifth in it, which serves to obscure the tonal center. So it's parallel fifths all over the place, which one of the reasons we avoid them in traditional composition is because when you have that movement from a parallel fifth, it really makes you wonder, makes your ear kind of disoriented and sort of obscures where the tonal center is. And so if you're doing that on purpose, that is the effect. But at the same time, it gives a degree of unity because it's just moving this chord structure up and down. So it's just a transposition of what happened before. So there's a balance, I think, between obscuring the tonal center but also giving a certain amount of unity and cohesiveness to the passage. So that's the basic idea of planing. Now there are two different varieties, and these are pretty self-explanatory because we've talked about things like real sequences and tonal sequences. So these are kind of related to that. But the first is called real planing, and that's where you have parallel chord movement, but it would be quote unquote chromatic. So when you move to the new chord, you have the same major, minor, perfect intervals in the chord, right? So you might be adding accidentals. And then you have diatonic planing on the other side of that, and that's just parallel chord movement within the scale. And so the quality of each interval does not stay the same. It conforms to whatever the key is. And the one I just showed you is actually an example of diatonic planing. Okay, so here's an example of parallelism and planing, and this is in a piece called Petrushka, which is an early Stravinsky ballet. This is one of the movements called, or one of the scenes called, Danse Russe. And I'll play it for you first, and you can get a sense of what this is all about. So this is actually for orchestra, but I have the piano reduction score in front of us, and I'm going to play the piano reduction as well. So let's give this a listen. And just by kind of looking at the score, you can see the parallelism in the top line. And notice you have that parallel movement while you have basically a repeated chord over and over again with some movement in there. But it gives this like kind of everything effect. You know, we're using all the notes that are in this scale. And it's held together because we're moving up and down the chord there. Let's listen to that one more time. So that top voice, that top part, always has the same shape of chord. It's just being moved up and down, right? So when I play that, after a while, from that repetition, it becomes kind of unclear where the tonal center is. Now, you know, it could be G. We have that pedal G there, but it is worth noting that that G is also a seventh chord because we have a G, a B, a D, and an F. And then in the left hand of the top piano part, we have an A and a G. So we have seconds, right? And then add that to this chord. So it's kind of G, maybe C, because there's no F sharps, right? You never really get a C major chord, but there's some ambiguity about what the tonal center is, but it's still held together because you have that parallelism, that planing effect in the top voice. Okay, one more concept, and this is sort of controversial, but the book does present it, so we should probably talk about it. It's something called pandiatonicism. It's a compositional technique in which each of the 7 diatonic pitches is given equal emphasis. So, in other words, the establishment of a tonic is deliberately avoided. Now, this just means that, you know, we are kind of treating each note of the scale as if it has just as much importance as the tonic note of the scale. So we're avoiding things like a dominant to tonic progression. We would avoid things like a leading tone to a tonic scale degree. We would avoid things like having the tonic triad. We might avoid having triads altogether, right? So there are a lot of different ways to do this, to avoid the establishment of a tonic. And the value of pandiatonicism is sort of debatable because, you know, if we're not even using tonality, can we call it diatonic? I guess. So there's some debate about whether or not it's an actual concept. I read something that was like, well, it's just kind of, you know, the notes of C major, but it kind of sounds bad. So that's an interesting way of looking at it. But, you know, I think it is worth knowing. So here's the same piece, and we're going to look at the next section actually and see how we could interpret this as pandiatonic. So this is again from Petrushka, Danse Russe. These are the next few bars in this section. And you'll see we've added the F sharp finally, right? Before we were mostly in what kind of sounded like C major, maybe G Mixolydian, right? But now we get these F sharps. And you can kind of see that in the bass we have an A, a D, and a D, right? Which suggests maybe an A major chord, maybe a D major chord, right? But for that A major chord, we also have the note G here. We have this sort of E, B, D, E cluster kind of thing, right? Which obscures that from sounding like an A chord. Then you have that F sharp and D stuff, but you have an E in this this line. And up here we have E's and A's and C's and E's, so you kind of get more obscured. Those notes don't belong in the key in the D major chord. And then in this next part, you'll see that we maintain that F sharp in that D, but we also now have that same A and A in the bass, right? So now this doesn't sound like an A major triad at all, right? Because it has an F sharp and a D in it. But yeah, so it's like the movement from one chord to the next is unclear, but we are sticking in the key, right, of maybe G major. So you could argue that since there's really no clear tonal center, there's no G major chord, right? And, you know, it's not a mode because we don't really get a clear statement of A or D. We just kind of have all the notes happening at once, and there are little melodic patterns that maybe this could be pandiatonic. So let's listen to this and see kind of what that sounds like and see if you can hear a tonal center in this. Maybe, maybe not, right? It's just kind of, it has that effect of like, okay, this is kind of just moving. It's almost like we're using all the notes of the scale in a percussive way rather than a melodic or harmonic way, right? We're just kind of picking notes that belong in the key and we're making them sound, you know, crunchy and percussive, and we're almost, you know, treating the orchestra, or in this case the piano, like it's a percussion instrument instead of an instrument that can play notes, right? Or pitches. So let's listen to this one more time. So, yeah, to me, I definitely buy that. You can't really pick out one chord as a particular tonic, right? You just kind of get all the notes of G major kind of happening in different patterns over and over again. You get the kind of this constant movement effect without any real sense of harmonic progression. And that's essentially what pandiatonicism is. And so in this case, I think that it definitely applies to a section of music like this. Okay. Well, that's it. Thanks so much for watching. We'll talk more about these in our Zoom sessions, and have a great day.